Alrighty, so hi, my name is Kierian Turner, and my research project title is binaural audio the future of hip-hop music? So hip-hop as a genre is a genre of music where the main focal point is in the center, even though it is mixed in stereo in modern day. And as a genre that requires lots of energy, hip-hop is driven by the rhythmic and the bass elements, yet it remains more or less static due to that focal point in the center. And the vocals and the beat are of primary importance, and the relationship between those two is what creates the groove of the track. And so spatialized audio. Considerations to keep in mind when studying audio spatialization and the reasons composers and artists utilize this are the effects on the listening experience, the structure, the perception, the segregation versus the blending of music, motion versus stasis, and conveying sound naturally versus unnaturally. And this comes from Peters et al. And certain aspects are definitely way more important than others in certain genres. And spatialization isn't used a whole lot in hip-hop music. And so definitely the more important aspects of spatialized audio for hip-hop are definitely the listening experience. And that was kind of emphasized in my study a lot. And also the structure, and also kind of the blending of the music and that balance between the vocals and the beat and all of the background elements. And another category is immersive audio. And Kierian et al. Argues that immersive audio is the next generation of audio experience. And what I was kind of trying to figure out in this study is that true for types of music such as hip-hop? And so my intention is to investigate whether the future of hip-hop listening will be realized through these immersive listening experiences. And I will investigate whether or not binaural audio in hip-hop adds to the feeling of immersion or distracts from it when compared to a traditional stereo mix. And so some of the research questions that came from these objectives were, when comparing binaural hip-hop to stereo hip-hop, which mixed version between stereo and binaural allows the listener to feel more connected with the lyrics and immersed in the performance? How does spatialized audio affect the perceived energy and the overall rhythmic drive of the performance? And what are the impacts of having audio all around the listener, including non-traditional locations, such as under, above, behind the listener? And so in this project, my goal was to investigate the effects that mixing in binaural has on this drive of the music, as this is one of the main important elements of hip-hop, and most of the listeners kind of pointed that out as an important aspect. And I wanted to explore the effects that 3D spatialized sound has on hip-hop as a lyrically driven style, given the drastic change from a static center-focused music to spatialized binaural music. And I also explored how having the ability to localize these non-traditional electronic sounds impacts the listening experience. And so, creating the stimuli, I composed and produced 2 different beats, and then I recorded with the psychologist rapping over these beats, and one track was consisting of previously recorded lyrics from his song Purple Black, and the other consisted of newly written lyrics, and then I proceeded to mix each track in stereo and then in binaural. And so the stereo and binaural mixing, the stereo mixes were done in Studio One at the University of Lethbridge here on the SSL Duality, and then the binaural mixes were done using Clang VR. And the binaural mixes, I was definitely very experimental with these lyrics, with the mixing, and especially with the vocals. And I wanted to definitely push the boundaries with these new mixing capabilities. And so I was attempting to mix certain elements in very non-conventional ways in order to see how it impacted the listening experience. And so this is the Clang interface. And so as you can see in the right-hand picture, there is 2 different circles, so that can create depth in the mix. And I will talk about some of the challenges later on, but currently we only have 8 channels in Clang, so I was kind of very limited to the amount of places that I was able to place different elements. And so this is the first binaural mix from my study and exactly how I mixed it. In the left picture, you can see most of the stuff was at normal height, except for the 2 channels that are at the bottom there, and that was the bass elements of the piece. I found that having the bass elements underneath the mix really created like cool, warm sound, and it kind of had its own headspace. So I definitely enjoyed placing those instruments there. And then of course there's the vocals in the center. I didn't actually use channel 8, which is the one down in the center at the bottom on the right picture. And then yeah, I had for this binaural mix, I had double-tracked vocals for the chorus, and they were panned in channel 5 and 6. They're the orange ones in the picture, so they were just slightly behind the listener. And then so I'm just going to play the stereo mix for the first piece.
Till that fateful day finally comes up, y'all gon' claim it, wasting your time. I had a lot of haters till I claim knowing me. Said I was hideous, now they want me. But I be too picky, life is too tricky to be stuck with someone incompatible. They want me shorty, now the narcissist. High maintenance ain't for me, I insist. Lady girl, a big heart, that's my list. It won't cost a thing for you to get wild. Pockets so full, haters in denial. Tick-tock, time ticking, can I make it rain? Good mama, for all of that I go extra mile. It won't cost a thing for you to get wild. Pockets so full, haters in denial. Tick-tock, time ticking, can I make it rain? Good mama, for all of that I go extra mile.
So that is the stereo mix from the first piece, and if you're wanting to hear the binaural mix, there is a playlist that has all of the binaural and stereo mixes in it that is incorporated in Michelle and Martine's presentations. So if you follow that link and if you have a good pair of headphones, you can listen to all those mixes as obviously binaural is it only sounds good on headphones. It's not meant to be listened back on speakers unless you have crosstalk cancellation and all that kind of stuff. So that's the stereo mix, and like I said, in the binaural mix, those double-tracked vocals at the end, they're mixed kind of just behind the listener, and I'll talk about that more later and how that impacted the listening experience. And like I said, the bass elements were underneath the mix and just slightly behind the listener. And now I will play the stereo mix from the second piece, and then I'll talk about how I spatialized that in binaural.
Me try to put you down, step out you with a frown, make you uncomfortable, the conversation when you're around. Your whole life, I've always been an outcast. Why they got you on the line, they ain't knowing that you're gone. Yeah, what's up, looking that way, or just getting the blood. Automatic conviction, got him assuming he's a criminal. You must be an angel, son of a gun, that's a common conception. Sometimes it kind of feels like the light of your skin, the closer to perfection. Darker the more prone to rejection. These are the harsh realities we're living in. Because I'm darker, I'm less respectful than my fellow of a brother. The aftermath of the slavery, as so trifling as the ridicule. Forgive them is the pitiful. Such ignorance only exposes shallowness. Call it blindness. They're so blind. I call it blindness. They may stare at you as if you're a different creature, acting superior whenever they are with you. And they may taunt, look down and treat you different. Just know you're unique, therefore you're special. They may stare at you as if you're a different creature, acting superior whenever they are with you. And they may taunt, look down and treat you different. Remember, you're too loud, it's not for you. Till that fateful day finally comes.
There we go. So this is the binaural mix for that piece, and also Toby just walked in at the back left. That is the psychologist. I don't know if you want to... this is the binaural mix for that second track, which is the lyrics from Toby's track called Purple Black. And so obviously the vocals are still in the center there, and then the ad-libs, same thing, stereo effect left and right. And then I also had the main drums in that same track as well. And then on that same circle, channel 2, the pink, that's where the second layer of drums was, just kind of an additional layer just with some of the cymbals and some like clicks and beeps and that sort of stuff, which was mixed a lot softer, but slightly behind the listener. And then that's also, and it was slightly underneath too, as you can see on the left picture. And that's also where the bass was again, and it kind of brought out its headspace. And then I also had the string section. I really liked the string section underneath too as well. And then on the outer rim, that's where the piano was. And yeah, and then I also had some of the second layer of ad-libs on that back channel in the center. And so now to my study. So the untrained participant recruitment criteria was as follows. They must have previously listened to hip-hop music and still currently do so. They must be between the ages of 18 to 40 years old. They must currently be in the city of Lethbridge, and they must have listening experience with headphones when it comes to stereo hip-hop mixes. And some of them were regular, just like hip-hop listeners, and others were independent hip-hop artists and producers themselves. And then, so from my participants, there was 6 female participants, 12 male participants, and 1 that was unspecified. And 12 of them were between the ages of 20 to 24, 5 between ages 25 to 29, 1 between 35 and 39, and a final participant between age 55 to 59. And so he was one of the trained listeners. And the reason why those trained listeners were brought on was because I initially I wanted 60 non-trained listeners, and since I hit that cap, I had a pretty cool opportunity to incorporate some trained listeners in this study as well. And of the 60 non-trained participants, 4 were producers and rappers themselves, and the others just like to listen to hip-hop music. And the final 3 participants were technically trained engineers. And so the listening test procedure, I conducted listening tests in Studio 1 at the University of Lethbridge with 6 different groups, 5 untrained and 1 trained, and each of the groups listened to the mixes in different orders. And this was because sometimes you can get biased from what you hear first versus what you hear second, so I wanted to change up the order of the mixes so that not all the results were just kind of leaning towards one sort of listening criteria. And so each group was given a preliminary listen through each of the 4 mixes, and then they were given the survey. And they then were given the opportunity to listen to the first track, both mixes, twice through again, and then once they finished answering those questions, we moved on to the second track and did the same thing. And the listening test survey questions were as follows. Please answer the following question for each pair of mixes. Which of these 2 mixes allows you to connect with the lyrics more, A or B, and C or D? Explain to which extent. Which mix evokes the feeling of being immersed in the performance more? Same thing. Based on your experience listening to recent hip-hop tracks, which 2 of 4 mixes better conveys the energy of the performance? And which 2 of 4 mixes allows you to localize the different sounds better? And did this better localization take away from the pleasure of the listening, have no effect on the experience, or add to the experience? And did the spatialization of the sound sources in mix A, B, C, and D take away from the experience, have no effect on the experience, or add to the experience? And the only results that I have put into graphs so far are the connections with the lyrics, which I think is one of the most important ones anyway. What I found interesting was there was some people that really just liked the traditional low sound localization and the traditional placement of the lyrics within the stereo field. So they were almost stereo throughout most of the questions. And then there were more people who liked the second binaural mix as opposed to the first binaural mix. So that's why you see a lot of people also in the stereo then binaural category. And then there weren't too many people who liked the first binaural mix and the second stereo mix, and same thing with people liking both binaural mixes. And a lot of the feedback was based around the placement of the lyrics and the placement of the vocals within the mix. A lot of people found having the lyrics just slightly behind was kind of taking away from the experience, because their focus was no longer in that center channel, and it was kind of being pulled all over the place. So they kind of referred to it as being too much surround. And then there were, of course, people who actually really enjoyed that and said it made them feel more immersed in the performance because it felt like they were right there and that the rapper was rapping right into their ears, basically. So I found that very interesting. And some of the challenges throughout the process, being my first time mixing with Klang, there were some challenges. Only having 8 mono tracks or 4 stereo tracks for the Klang input limited me to having to sum a lot of the tracks by sending them to the Klang input. So some of the participants said that they felt that in the binaural mixes, a lot of the elements were fighting for space, and that's because for some of those placements around that binaural field, I had to put 3 or 4 elements in that one spot, just due to only having the 8 inputs. And then they recognized that some of the inputs that only had 1 or 2 kind of sounded more full, and that they were able to localize those sounds better. And I was also then limited to 8 positions around this massive 360-degree sphere in terms of spatializing the sounds. And it would be awesome to have more of those positions to be able to experiment more with depth, and especially with those height channels, because I was, as you saw in some of the cases, I was only able to do 2 of those things without completely compromising some of the other elements. And so this led me to thinking about a lot of potential follow-up studies. So I would like to do a follow-up study where I do a similar perceptual listening test, but mix in binaural in a more conservative fashion, and keep more of the primary features in that center channel, so it's more true to the way, or I guess the mixing practices of hip-hop music. And a lot of my thoughts around this are that often when you're mixing in 5.12, you still want to have all your primary elements in that stereo field of the 5.1. So I feel like, especially for hip-hop music, it's kind of that same thing. You have to have all your core elements in your front channels. And one thing I did find interesting is no one thought that the bass elements under the mix and behind the listener in some cases, no one pointed that out as being distracting. So I found that to be very interesting. And also with some of the other background elements that were behind the listener, no one pointed those out as being too distracting. It was mainly the vocals. I would love to do this study with more trained listeners as well to get their perceptions on these mixes. And also with questions around localization, there were some participants who I feel did not fully understand what localization meant. So that caused some challenges for that question specifically. And it would be awesome if I was able to work with more channels in Klang, but if this was not possible, I would also try maybe sending various, only certain elements to Klang at one time, outputting that back into Pro Tools, and then sending another chunk of 8 elements that in Pro Tools would affect the end product. And yeah. So my conclusion, the future of...
Sorry, you will have to stop. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Sorry.